yesterday we went into a lot of details about surprises that they found in all of the planets that did not fit the nothing ever happened model. Today we're going to go into more of the theoretical approach. It turns out that at about the same time they were discovering things weren't the way they thought, they also started revising the theoretical models. And there's a lot of the stuff that they say now that fits perfectly with what we say. You just don't see it in the texts that often because they still prefer to teach, well, things are pretty much the way they were. There was just a little change here and there. When Snyder said this about reading, and that this is from an article that says that basically all scientific articles are wrong, and he says, I don't read it just to get facts that I need to then memorize. He says, you get ideas from reading all of these things. And that's kind of the approach here. A lot of the things we say may not be quite 100% accurate, but you're here to get ideas. Turns out that cone hats are common throughout the world, and these quotations are from, there's a magazine called Mental Floss, and they have a whole bunch of very interesting small short articles, and in one of them they talked about that nearly every culture has cone hats. And they said, what's the allure of the cone hats? Well, they quite adequately supported their statement that everybody's got cone hats, but they didn't really have a good idea as about why the allure of those. A lot of you may have seen the Conehead videos. Turns out that the Coneheads are back. They're doing some kind of insurance commercial now. But we can explain the cone hats without having to worry about aliens. A lot of people have talked about the axis of the world pillar, the world this, the world that, but it's something that everybody described in their ancient mythology. And they referred to it basically as some kind of a connection between the heavens and the earth. And they have all kind of symbols. The big towers, mountains, and the ladder. People have talked about Jacob's ladder, and it was a plasma that was used in the 1930s Frankenstein movie and is quite popular, but it may also be the same Jacob's ladder that was mentioned in the ancient mythology. Back to the cone part, all of these intersections of the heavens and the earth usually involved some kind of tower or mountain, and at the top of the mountain was the abode of the gods. But very often there was a cone of a mountain involved. World axis shapes from all over the world, and they have the same type of reaching to the heavens type image, and even went with gold cone hats. It was so popular to have the cone effect. Hittites had their own cone, and their cones looked very similar to the carvings of the mountains that we had seen previously. This one's from Bengal, and all of these are usually associated with religious ceremonies or holidays, which we now know are religious type, ancient religion, and or bring good luck. And they all have the pretty typical cone. The Conehead of Hephaestus was basically the result of the interaction of two gods. Japanese Casca cone hat looks very similar to one of their major sacred mountains. Koreans have a cone hat that is used on holidays, but mainly like the New Year, which was mentioned earlier. This one was a cone hat, and again, the importance of this person was he was a chieftain or the god or the whatever person had interacted with the gods. In Persian area, they have the Conehead Hill, where there are a lot of statues with cone hats, and even now what are called the dervishes use cone hats in their ceremonies, and you can see that the twirling even gives them more of a cone effect. Lots more cones, Greece, Roman, and these also often associated either with the rulers or the religious people. A lot of people familiar with this soft cone hat. It's called the Phrygian cone, but it wasn't always soft. The Romans at least had a dress ceremony metal hat like this with a little emblem on the front. There's the capuchon in the Cajun Mardi Gras celebrations, and it again looks just like all of the other symbols of the cone from the past. This one, mention it in particular because the person called himself or herself, it turns out they now think it was probably a female, but the ruler of the sun. This one's a little more involved from the standpoint of here's the story that goes with it, and there was a time when it was raining everywhere, and the goddess came down, shielded everybody with this large cone hat, and then basically telling stories, and kind of like today, people kind of drift off. And when they woke up, she was gone. And that has been mentioned earlier that the gods disappeared. And this was a typical representation of the fact that people used to interact with the gods, and now the gods disappeared. So how big was this tree or mountain or whatever it was? In this person says was so huge that the branches stretched out over heaven and earth alike. No doubt that it was visible and impressive, but on the world axis slide, it was just like a true axis that you didn't see, and that's what most people now think of it as being. But Vandersloot says, why did they say they could see the axis? And a lot of mythologists admit that, yeah, they said they saw it, but they don't seem to ask why. Well, it was because it was on the super plasma TV screen in the sky. And that's why everybody could see it. And this plasma model, Vandersloot says, basically explains a lot of the aspects of the things that the people said they saw interacting with the gods in the past. And you've seen this, perhaps, discussion of the plasma influence, and the first one's the plasma, the second one is the petroglyph, and then there's 3 plasmas and 2 petroglyphs, but he has pretty well shown that there is a distinct correlation between the visible plasma in the sky that was probably more enhanced than now and the petroglyphs. This is an artist rendition of some work that has recently been done showing that that these now exist, except if you can imagine if they were considerably brighter than they are now, that it would be very impressive. And in fact, this was rather recent. The pareidolia is the kind of thing of you look out and you see stuff that isn't really there, but it looks a whole lot like Elvis or whatever. So what's the lure then of Coneheads? The previous speakers have also noted that a lot of this interaction caused emotions in the past, and so you can imagine that if you saw something in the sky that looked like it was wearing a cone hat and it was powerful, that you might try to go with the cone hat stuff itself. Of course, there's other theories. And as they said in the opposable mind, if you can keep at least 2 theories in mind and playing off of each other, that you have a better chance of coming up with something useful. This one's listed first on the program, and as I said, is slightly associated with the one yesterday. We're talking about the 1950 concepts, and they were basically nothing happened. And you can explain a lot of stuff by saying nothing happened, because during a lot of that time period, nothing happened. But it turns out that what you found with all the space probes didn't fit that nothing happened. And, you know, starting out with that's fine, but the problem was they used it for saying that anybody else is wrong. If you say something catastrophic happened, you've got to be wrong because nothing happened. And the bad part about it is that they used it to claim that mythology is pure fiction because nothing happened, so therefore mythology must be pure fiction. But even by the 60s, the astronomers had started saying, well, that's not quite right. There's possibility that something happened, but it took a long time for people to be able to discuss it openly. Now, this last quotation by Ager was a geologist, and he was in the camp that probably nothing happened, but maybe something every now and then happened. But what we're talking about is a whole lot more than he would have even thought. But then people starting saying, well, maybe it's not exactly the way we described as everything forming in the same orbits X billion years ago. They talked about the possibility of the larger planets even erupting. I mean, the terrestrial planets erupting from the giant planets. And they came up with other stuff. McRae at this time was the head of the Royal Astronomical Society in England, and he said nothing originated inside the orbit of Jupiter. Well, if it didn't, then we're here, so something happened after that. And even more recently, this is from last week, so I don't have it listed there, but it says, a new series of simulation scenarios suggests that Jupiter may have formed in a distant orbit, but temporarily invaded the orbital neighborhood of the present Earth before migrating back out. That's a lot of changes. And they say, hey, Mercury might not have even been here for over 400 million years because of its orbital characteristics. And another major change, it might have even been a moon of Venus. And another thing that came out last week is thing about Mercury may have been the sole survivor of close orbiting planets around the sun, that their system may have contained as many as 4 planets orbiting closer to the sun than Venus. And it says, this is particularly important because of the ancient arguments, well, the 1950s arguments about why nothing had happened. And they say, it is not rare to have a pair of planets go unstable and others not feel a thing. And in 1950 time period, they said that they can't go unstable, nothing can change, and if it did, it'd mess up everything. But apparently that's not quite right. So now they say, hey, stuff bounced all over the place. Not only did you have planets bouncing all over the place, but stuff was even colliding with some of the planets. Turns out that there's apparently some dichotomy in the 2 hemispheres of Mars, and so to explain that, they said, maybe a big asteroid hit it. And now they're even saying that the moons may collide and may do so within the next 10 million years. Well, again, you're back to the question of if something can collide in the next 10 million years, well, what happened in the last 10 million years, or even 10,000 years? And again, back to the things that people are willing to consider now, that Jupiter and Saturn formed in completely different ways. Well, that should be no surprise to us. And something formed twice the size of Earth at 18 AU, and since it's not there now, well, it probably hit something. Maybe it hit Mars and caused the dichotomy. As I said, not everybody's surprised here, and that Jupiter and Saturn formed completely different ways wouldn't be odd from the standpoint of either the plasma model or now from the brown dwarf model, which we will get to in a second. But just like all policies, you got to have a disclaimer. And I'm not saying that any of the people that I quote were correct, but you can now discuss that kind of a thing. And you cannot use uniformity as proof that nothing happened and that the stuff that we're talking about could not have happened. And I think mainstream astronomy now knows that, admitting it's something else. Schultz's star is considered a brown dwarf with a companion, and it supposedly interacted with our solar system 70,000 years ago. This gives just a little perspective about where they think it came through, and that outer gray cloud is the Oort cloud, where they think all of the iceberg comets came from. But that's quite close. And they say that, hey, these brown dwarfs flash occasionally, and even Crockett says, well, it may have been that people on Earth at that time could have seen these flashes, but more along the way we think, what about the interaction of their plasma sheaths? That probably gave more of an interaction than the flashes that they see randomly from brown dwarfs. But now they're also saying that, hey, planets may not have all formed by accretion X billion years ago. A whole bunch of different ways that they could have formed. And for the brown dwarf, they said, well, before they actually saw a brown dwarf, they said, we've got an idea of how they formed. But then after they found brown dwarfs, they said, hey, you had to be there to know based on the characteristics we see, and nobody was there. So you've got all these various possibilities that could have created brown dwarfs and or planets. And they say the Schultz's star was the closest interaction between our solar system and another star, in this case the brown dwarf. It might have been, but Cardona suggests that that might not have been the closest approach, and Wall gave a lot of description of what Cardona thinks, and these books are extremely useful as far as getting a lot of the detail and the support for his ideas. And it turns out that there's plenty of debris out there to have intersected with our system. To use the old term, there's billions and billions of stars out there or planets out there that could have interacted. And in fact, there was another thing that came out recently that I didn't get into here, is they say that solo planets may be surprisingly common wandering worlds with no parent star, raise questions about what it means to be a planet. So there's plenty of stuff out there that could have interacted with us within the last 10,000 years. So they started out with nothing can happen. Then they said, well, maybe something did happen. And then they said, maybe planets didn't form the way we thought they did. And now even interactions of our system with a binary set, including a brown dwarf. So we've gone from absolutely nothing could happen to, gee, we're not sure how all of this stuff happened. Like the last one in particular, the Kuiper belt, that gray circle that I was talking about, said they've only known about that for a while, but know next to nothing about how the solar system formed. I think they're absolutely correct. Eva Emerson is the editor-in-chief of the Science News magazine, and recently she said this: of course, as we learn in every issue, knowledge is not written in stone, it's shifty at best, and pursuing it is at least half the fun. Thank you.